Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 1 of the America's Challengers Tournament. We are finally here at the big international capstone for everything we've been covering in Tier 2 across this year. We've been covering the NACL every single game in North America over the course of this entire year, spring and summer, and it's led to this big international tournament. Of course, it's not just the NACL participating. This is an America's tournament, so North America, Brazil, LATAM, they're all performing here at this tournament. It's the best of the best from Tier 2 across all of the Americas. I'm very excited to jump into it. I hope you guys are as well. I'll quickly say, if you do want to know my thoughts on how things ended in the NACL, maybe get some preliminary thoughts on my, feelings in terms of these NACL teams, check out the finals video up in the iCard. That's going to be the two teams that are representing North America at this tournament. I don't have quite as much knowledge, of course, on Brazil and LATAM and their scene and their teams, but I did do, as much research as I could, prepping for Worlds and finishing off the LCK and everything before the start of these games. I'll just say, I do think that the Brazilian teams are pretty strong, actively pretty good. LATAM, I think, could definitely have some good performances. There are some very familiar players in terms of some of the LATAM teams from even Tier 1, and so, I'm excited for this tournament. I think it could be one of the more fun ones of the year. Of course, this is also really interesting because it's going to be the first tournament, the first real pro play on the Worlds patch 14.18. So a lot to learn here. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well, but I don't want to waste you guys' time. Let's get right into the analysis. If you are new here, what we are going to do, of course, is go game by game here on day number 1, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and we'll kind of talk about how the standings end up falling at the end of the video. Remember, it's single round robin here for the first stage. You just have to not be bottom 2 in order to get to the bracket, the best of 3 stage, but you can't be last. You can't be the worst in the entire league, or else you will be eliminated in this best of 1 stage. So for now, at the very least, best of 1, definitely a lot more about showing up early than it is about being perfect. So we'll see what ends up happening. But our first game, our first game of the entire tournament, is actually a pretty good one that I was very excited to see. It's a matchup between WAP Esports and Dragonsteel, and Dragonsteel is going to pick up the win here. Of course, Dragonsteel being the number 1 team, the number 1 seed coming out of the NACL in North America. WAP Esports also, of course, coming out as a number 1 seed here. They are coming in from LATAM South and their Tier 2 region. They were pretty interesting to watch in the playoffs. They didn't go in as major favorites as far as I could tell, but their gameplay was actually really solid, and they have a lot of familiar names here. If you are a longtime fan of LATAM or even just international esports, you have someone like Kindless, who I remember back years ago, over 5-6 years ago at MSI. Very, very long-time player there for LATAM. You have players like QQ Moore, who I know have played near top level before. Shuhari has played near top level before, and so you've got some players on this team that have played not only in Tier 1 but in Tier 1 playoffs, and even some MSI caliber players here for WAP Esports. They're certainly not a pushover by any means. Dragonsteel, of course, are kind of the favorites going into the tournament. I think for a lot of people, NA being the major region of these 3, I think is just expected to do the best, and Dragonsteel was the best team in the NACL, and they kind of back that up here in game number 1. This was a pretty good showing from them overall, I would say. I still am a bit worried about their ability to just hands check the teams that they're going up into, because I think this is going to be a huge step up in terms of mechanics from just the consistency that we were seeing them play against in the NACL. I'm not saying the NACL is bad, trust me. Anybody who's watched my videos over the course of this year knows I do not believe that, but I certainly do think they're going to have to rely a bit more on their macro to be able to win games, which is what they did in game number 1 here. They actually were getting a bit hands diffed in some of these fights. A couple of really good plays from QQ Moore and DD and even Shuhari at times where, they were being super aggressive and trying to create a lot of opportunities for WAP, and unfortunately, WAP just couldn't hang on in the side lanes. That's really where things ended up falling apart for them, but you got to give a lot of credit to the player with 100% KP. That's Yuji, of course, in the jungle here for Dragonsteel, the back-to-back MVP. He was my choice for MVP as well. In the NACL, this guy has been ridiculous. Even when he's not, shining in terms of the damage that he's able to output, he still is so valuable and so vital to this team's success in terms of setting things up and, of course, securing objectives, which is something Dragonsteel has been very good at throughout this year. Like I said, I do think it's going to be very important for them to focus on the macro game, because I don't think they can hands diff quite as much as they would be able to in a traditional regular season game in the NACL. And if UG is going to be moving around the map and creating the opportunities that he was in this game, especially early on things like Zyra, I do think that opens up things for Dragonsteel a lot more. It allows players like Spyrex to get out on the map and move around, which is obviously what he is best at. Players like Zyko and Scary Jerry to be aggressive in terms of their trading patterns, and Zamudo to continue to play a ridiculously aggressive Udyr on the top side, which we can get to now. I think Zamudo was another player that you might look at the scoreline and say that it wasn't necessarily a great game from him, but this was a counter pick with the Urgot on the other side, and he was still just 1v1ing him in his side lane basically the entire game. I'm not the biggest fan of Udyr, but Zamudo is so good at this champion. It's been kind of a signature pick for him over his time in the NACL, and he continues to prove why. This was an unstoppable beast in side lanes. There was really no way to deal with him in the later half of the game. Nobody you could send could actually deal with him, and even by the end, like, Thorin was trying to fight him 1v1, like, underneath his inhibitor tower, and he was getting absolutely obliterated by Baron minions and by Udyr and just the healing and everything. So it ended up not even really being all that effective of a counter pick. Zamudo was still very relevant in this game. Jerry and Zyko I thought were very underratedly good. Zyko in particular I thought had a couple of really nice engages. He's just very willing to pull the trigger. It feels like he's on the same page as UG and Jerry and, Zamudo all the time. It feels like they have very good communication, and so in these situations where Zyko is very willing and very aggressive to go in, it always feels like he's going to have backup, and it does make it very difficult to try to play into Dragonsteel when you have a gold disadvantage. Jerry did the most damage in the game. Varus, even after the nerfs, is still going to be playable. I don't know how much we're going to see him at the tournament, the rest of this tournament, because I do think he will quietly get phased out as people realize that you can just do more damage on other champs, but Varus, very much still playable. Spyrex was fine. Overall, just a good game one from Dragonsteel. They're the favorites going into this tournament, and I think they back that up here with their gameplay. But for WAP on the other side, some positives and some negatives. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Thorin in the top lane. Again, we talked about this, but the Urgot just didn't really matter. The longer this game went on, the Udyr just ended up being inevitable, and if you're going to draft something to specifically counterpick the Udyr, you need to counterpick the Udyr. And the aggressive plays that the Urgot was making throughout this game, some of it was positive, some of it was negative, and I think that when you look at the overall tempo of the game, they started to lose it more and more the less that Urgot could actually compete, not only in that side lane, but in a lot of these aggressive 5v5s where he was getting blown up relatively quickly. I do think there are other options for this. I mean, Shuhari goes 0-6 and 4. I think he was fine. I thought the Leona was generally okay. I think you would really only be giving it to him because he was the sacrificial lamb in a lot of these fights, but he was doing his job as Leona. It just didn't end up working out towards the back half of this game. Some of those engages I even think were pretty good. DD and QQ were definitely kind of the go-getters, I would say, from WAP. I think QQ felt like he had opportunities in the early game. He was just getting out-macroed by UG, who was getting every single objective on the map. Slowly but surely, that gold lead started to grow for Dragonsteel until eventually it was a bit out of control. And DD, I thought, fought really well here on the Tristana, but again, I just don't think was aggressive enough in some of these exchanges. I do think that when he was able to get resets and was able to kind of be in the fights, he looked really good, but overall, this very much felt like a mentality difference between the teams. Dragonsteel very much knew exactly where they needed to be at any given time, whereas WAP, I think, was kind of wandering around a little bit less, I guess, decisive in terms of their decisions, and I think that really cost them in game number one. But it's just game number one. It's single round robin across this first stage, and so you've got 5 games to not be bottom 2. Not a great start for WAP, but certainly not, unsalvageable against arguably the best team in the league. But for Dragonsteel, this is the expected outcome in terms of starting off this tournament. They probably want to go undefeated, at least in the main stage. I think that's their expectation. Going into something like this, I'm not sure that's going to be achievable. I do think that the rest of the teams in this tournament are really, really solid, but it's definitely, a pretty solid start for Dragonsteel if you can see them even level up more as the tournament goes on. But then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and unlike the first, this is definitely not the outcome I was expecting for this matchup. It was Fuego taking on VKS Academy, and Fuego picking up the victory. This is certainly not what I was anticipating. Of course, Fuego being the representative from LATAM North, they were the champions there, and kind of the dominant, super team champions of LATAM North. They went undefeated in the playoffs. I think they went 9-0 across their playoff run. I only watched the finals, but they looked dominant in the finals, and so you felt pretty good about that. It's hard to really know how strong a finals performance is when you don't know the context of the league, but Fuego looked amazing in their domestic play, and they came out here and they looked resilient in game number 1 for them at this tournament. Vivo Keydstars is not a bad team at all. VKS is certainly not a team that you can overlook. They came in incredibly good form as the number 1 seed coming out of the Brazilian Tier 2 league, and they kind of just got bounced here. Like, they had this game in the palm of their hands, and they made a couple of mistakes, and all of a sudden it was gone. They couldn't win anymore. There are obviously a lot of familiar names in here for people who might not be as familiar with these two teams. ADD is going to probably be the most famous former LCK, LPL, NACL top laner. He's been to Worlds for LATAM before, and so you know that this guy can play at least a pretty decent level, but, a couple of other players that I think are interesting to look at. I think Zelt we'll talk about as we go further along. Virus FX was really good in this game. We'll talk about him more as we go along, but for VKS, there are also a lot of familiar names, maybe for, longtime League of Legends fans. Kizzy in the mid lane. He is obviously a former OS player, played there for a long time, and he was a superstar for VKS in their playoff run. Like, he was exceptional in the finals performance that I watched. He is in really good form right now, and so to see him, have some ups and downs in this game, potentially not have the same kind of macro impact that you would expect, it's certainly a bit surprising, but someone like Tyrion also has experience at the top level in the CB LoL. Just a lot of good players, generally speaking, across both of these teams, but Fuego really proving that playoff success, that playoff dominance that they had was certainly not some sort of outlier or surprise, because, this was a really, really clean game here in game number 1. Player of the game is going to go to Zelt, like I said here on the Smolder. You can talk about whether or not this should have been as easy for the Smolder as it was, but Fuego had a game plan and they executed it really well. They understood that, we've got a Mumu Rel to set up for Smolder Kai'Sa. Yeah, we just scale. Like, we don't got to worry about the early game. We can go down in gold. We can even be down in gold at 30-ish minutes into the game, and we're going to be able to win these team fights so hard that it's not really going to matter. It's a really good understanding of how to play out this comp. We talk about this a lot. I don't think you have to be passive on things like Smolder and Kai'Sa. Trust me, I think if you get those early leads, the game becomes even easier in a lot of those instances, but you're not punished as hard for being passive in the early game. So Zelt getting really, really strong and just being able to obliterate, quite frankly, every single fight across the rest of this game. It was really massive. I think he is definitely the player that stood out the most for me, but Virus FX, couple of really great angles here on Kai'Sa. You can definitely tell the difference between people who are very comfortable on Kai'Sa and people who just kind of play Kai'Sa. Virus is clearly one of those players that has a lot of time and a lot of practice on Kai'Sa because he just sees a lot of the angles and a lot of the aggressive plays that you don't really see out of players who are just a little bit more scared on the champion. He plays her like an assassin, and that's honestly the best way to play her, is being able to get in and deal as much damage as possible at the right time. As long as you're not putting yourself in immediate danger, then it's probably fine. Mataz was also really good in the jungle. Typically, I'm not a fan of this Amumu pick. I think overall, I've talked about it a lot in the NACL and especially in the LCS. I think that there are just other champions that do this job, but a little bit more effective. I think it is significantly more understandable when Sejuani, Maokai, and Vi are all off the board like they were in this game. I think all of a sudden Amumu then becomes a priority pick because it is probably the most consistent of the options left. I just don't like picking it over champions like Sejuani or Vi or things like that, but this was probably one of the more consistent Amumu games that I've seen in Pro over the past couple of weeks, so that's pretty solid. The only real concern I had for Fuego was the Jax on the top side. I really don't like blind pick Jax, and ADD I would have preferred a tank here. When you're looking at like the bones of this comp, you're really playing around the Smolder, you're playing around the Kai'Sa. I don't think having that secondary Jax win condition is necessary in this game, but he was fine. He was definitely good in the back half of these fights, even if he wasn't all that relevant at the beginning of this game. But overall, huge win for Fuego to kick off their tournament. This is an upset, like, for sure, especially in Brazil with the crowd cheering for VKS. This is a really big win for them, and if they can like keep this momentum up and show that super team status and performance that they had domestically can carry over into this tournament, that's going to be a real big problem for a lot of teams at this tournament. But for VKS, you got to be a little bit disappointed. This is certainly not the outcome I think that you were looking for. We talked about how they were in really good form. They kind of surprisingly, I guess in my opinion, took that finals. I think Pain were definitely considered favorites going into that finals domestically, but VKS was able to pull it out because Kizzy was in such good form in the mid lane. Tyrion, I thought, played really well in that series. Morteus was somebody that I was really impressed by in terms of their performance, but just not really showing that in game number 1. I think that there were definitely some performances that were good individually. I think that you can talk about, how Kizzy and Morteus in particular, I thought were very effective in this game. I think even Sorolu was pretty good in this one and has been pretty good recently. I just think that where VKS fell apart is very similar to kind of what we talked about in game number 1 for WAP, where even though they had this big gold lead and were in a pretty decent position, you had, a Vladimir that had a bit of gold, you had a Tristana that you could potentially play through, you even had a lot of macro threats with things like Skarner and Ziggs and Alistair that can create opportunities in situations that they wouldn't normally, have them. You just weren't able to, push that advantage. You made a couple of mistakes, you end up over-committing to try to save Tyrion on the bot side in a dive, and it just ends up completely obliterating a lot of the goodwill and the actual gold that you had been able to generate over the course of this game, and you're basically allowing the Smolder and the Kaisa to get back into a position where they feel a lot more comfortable. That's not really ideal, and I think they were just a little bit slow to the 8-ball on this one, and I think that is a bit concerning for me. Tyrion is going to get dead of the game. This R5 Vladimir was supposed to be this gigantic counter pick that was supposed to take over, just never really ended up playing out like that. I feel bad giving him dead of the game because I do think that he was fine, generally speaking, here, but I didn't have a better option. There was nobody on this team that I felt like played worse or anything like that. Like, Sorolu was probably the other player that I considered here in the jungle, but I don't think anybody played horrible on VKS. I think this was more of just a couple of bad decisions, committing to some fights that gave Fuego opportunities to get back into the game, and then Fuego being clinical enough to be able to capitalize on those opportunities. That's kind of what ended this one. So for VKS, I think you have to be able to bounce back soon. This is really not the result you were expecting, especially because you're the first Brazilian team to perform at this tournament in Brazil. I think the crowd was super hyped, and they were really behind them, and they really wanted to see a victory here. Hopefully they can get that bounce back as the number 1 seed here, because it just didn't look super clean, I would say, in game number 1. It can definitely be worse, but it can definitely be better. And for Fuego, keep this up, man. If this team turns out to be legit, if that undefeated run in playoffs turns out to be legit, this is going to be a lot of fun to watch, because this team is very, very fun. Zelt and Virus were really aggressive in this game. ADD is obviously a bit of a fan favorite for a lot of people. Mataz was great to watch in this game. I think that there were just so many things here that were really interesting to see from Fuego, and I hope to see more of it moving forward. This was about as good of a start to the tournament as you could ask for. Maybe a more consistent early game, but you understood your comp strengths and you played towards it. This is exactly what you want to see from a team like Fuego. But now we're moving into the third game of day number 1, and this was the matchup of the day for me on paper. This was the one I was the most excited to see how it turned out, and it certainly lived up to expectations. It's Dragonsteel taking on Pain Academy. And Pain is going to pick up the win here. I did not expect that. This was a huge win for them. And honestly, Pain was the team I was most excited to watch more of coming into this tournament, coming out of, watching a lot of the tape for all of these teams before the tournament, the playoff tape, the finals tape for a couple of these teams. Pain was one that really stood out to me where it's like, okay, this team's really good. Like, there is a lot of interesting stuff to take away from their tape and from just generally their playstyle, because they're so aggressive and it's really entertaining to watch. And man, did it really work out here in game number 1. Dragonsteel was kind of expecting this to be a bit of an easy tournament for themselves, at least in terms of how they have answered a lot of their public questions. I think they came into this as, the favorites, the number 1 seed from the major region, and I think a lot of people, me included, anticipated them just kind of having a relatively easy time, at least at the beginning of this tournament, when it's not best of 3 or best of 5 or anything like that, but, best of 1, that makes it even more possible for these upsets to happen in a game number 1 type of scenario. And so Pain coming out, picking up the win, pretty massive to start off their tournament. Hidon is a very easy choice for player of the game here on the Yone. So many flank angles. I mean, so many creative Yone engage angles that you just want to see over and over again. Yone versus Yasuo here in game number 1 for Pain, and they got the better end of that deal. Spyrex was not nearly as relevant as Hidon was on the other side of this. Hidon is definitely a player to watch for Pain. This is one of the more aggressive players, I would say, in the entire tournament. He lives up to kind of the Brazilian top lane meta or historical value that role has. A lot of Brazilian top laners are just crazy, and they will constantly look for these creative engage angles, and Hidon is certainly no exception to that. He was excellent here in game number 1. The Yone is a pick that we've seen really succeed for a lot of teams in basically every region, whether it's in the mid lane, whether it's in the top lane. Yone actually feels like he's in a really good state right now. He didn't really receive that many changes going into this patch, and so I think he's actually going to be a pretty big priority pick, not only here, but, on everything 14-18, like Worlds as well. I think Yone is just in a really good spot to be able to be flexed around right now, and this was a really good performance of that. Marvin is the other other player that I was really impressed by on the Kaisa. Again, just doing a great job of taking over once the team is able to create for him. I love Tatu on the Sejuani. I thought he was really good at being able to actively create avenues for Pain to be able to close this game out, as contested as it was towards the back half, but Marvin really was the damage to be able to follow through. I think if you don't have one of Hidan, Tatu, or Marvin playing well in this game, you probably don't end up winning, because I didn't really talk about the game state, but Dragonsteel was coming back in this one. They certainly made it a lot more interesting. It felt like they were more cohesive in terms of these front-to-back 5v5s, which is not necessarily how I would have expected this game to go, but you got to give Dragonsteel credit in that regard. Pain ends up winning the one final fight that ends up mattering a lot in the back half of the game. We'll talk about it, Zyko, just with a pretty errant engage that really kind of sealed the fate of Dragonsteel, but Hidan, Tatu, Marvin, definitely the standouts for me when it comes to Pain Academy. And then for Dragonsteel, Zyko, like I said, going to get dud of the game here, just needed to be a bit more clinical in terms of how he performed in the back half. I don't think he played a bad game overall, but when you pull the trigger on Rel, when you go in and try to create and, say this is our opportunity to try to end the game and it doesn't work and you end up losing because of it, then unfortunately I'm going to have to call that out in the video. And that's what it was here for Zyko. I think, again, most of the rest of this game was fine from him on the Rel. I think that there were actually a couple of engages throughout the mid game here that were genuinely phenomenal from him. It just didn't really matter. It ended up coming back to bite them in the end. Zamudo was the other player I kind of considered just because of how risky he was playing the entirety of this game. The Rumble was obviously a very feast or famine pick for him throughout the entire year. It's kind of been like that for a lot of players, but he did a lot of damage and he also died a lot. You just have to kind of live with that when it comes to Zamudo. Him and Hidan are really not all that different in that regard. They are more than willing to put their own safety on the line to try to get some crazy playoff. I do think that Yuji and Scary Jerry were the standout players for Dragonsteel for me in this game. Yuji, I thought, again, had a really good game, really great pathing, great macro in the back half. Yuji honestly just looks like a star. Not only did he look like that in the NACL, but he looks like that here internationally as well. And Jerry, I thought, had a really good and effective game on the Ziggs, but only so much you can do on that champion. I just think Pain were better and a little bit more, they gave themselves more flexibility and more options to be able to win this game as it went further and further along. Dragonsteel essentially had to be perfect for the final 10 minutes of this game, and while they were close, they weren't quite perfect, and that meant that Pain was able to walk away with a win. Dragonsteel sitting at 1-1 after day number 1. It's of course not the worst thing in the world. It's really no difference whether or not you finish first or fourth in terms of how you finish this stage, as long as you don't finish in the bottom 2. But Dragonsteel, I'm sure, wanted to get that confidence boost by proving that they were the best team at this tournament. But right now, Pain getting that first win for the hometown crowd in Brazil and looking really good. Pain was the team I was most intrigued to watch coming into this tournament, and at least in the first game, they've definitely lived up to that hype. But then moving on now to game number 4, and it's the debut of the second NACL team here at this tournament. It's Fear X Starforge taking on WAP Esports, and Fear is going to pick up what is likely the most dominant win of the day up until this point. Basically, all 3 of the first 3 games were ridiculously close. They all had a lot of, push and pull, a lot of comebacks in the beginning part of this tournament, but Fear very much still showing that you can dominate the game from start to finish and be able to close it out. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier when it comes to these comps that a lot of people would look at and say, well, your win condition is front-to-back 5v5s. If you can scale into the game, then you're going to be able to win. And this idea that you have to play those comps very passively, I just disagree with that in terms of the mentality. If you are able to find these macro advantages across the map, if you are able to get a gold lead going into the mid game, then all of a sudden the game becomes way easier to win for everyone involved on your team. And that's what happened here. You were able to get gold on the Viego Rumble Smolder comp, and then all of a sudden you already win the 5v5s, and now you have a gold lead. This game is going to end, sub 26 minutes, and that's exactly how you want to dominate a game like this. It wasn't exactly like, a blowout. Like, this wasn't WAP not performing at all. There were moments where they were in this game, but I just think they really didn't have a lot of tempo or pressure really at any point, and the macro difference between, a lot of these top teams and some of the teams that we had bigger questions about, I definitely think that's becoming clearer and clearer. WAP in particular has not had a very good macro day overall going up against the 2 North American teams. But player of the game for me, it's kind of for debate. I think that there are definitely multiple options here for Fear. I'm going to land on XU here with the Viego. He was just very active on the map. I thought he did a good job in the mid game of making sure everybody had enough resources in order to continue to scale the game out of control, whether it was a Blaze Olive on the Smolder, whether it was the bot lane just in general, general, or Philip on the Rumble, who was winning the 1v1 in the counterpick matchup anyways. You know, XU, I think, was doing a really good job at making sure that all of the mouths to feed were fed, and I think he did a good job at acquiring resources, and obviously he's Viego in the late game. He's going to be able to take over a lot of these fights. He's going to be very integral in being able to close out this game just in general, so pretty good game overall by XU. Blaze Olive definitely deserves a shout out. A lot of people are going to be looking at Philip as well in the top lane on the Rumble. This is a counterpick, like this is, you got counterpick Olaf into Rumble, and yet the Olaf was, we'll talk about it, mega useless throughout the entirety of this game. I don't even think he did 5,000 damage in this game. It was genuinely absurd how little Thorin was able to do, and a lot of that was Philip just straight up being better in this matchup. He talked about it in the post-game interview, how comfortable he is playing the Rumble into Olaf, how, you know, this was not really the matchup he expected to be forced into when he blind picked the Rumble in a matchup like this, but you know, Philip is definitely the other option. But like I said, a Blaze Olive looking pretty good on the Smolder. Just generally speaking, he is very good on that champion. I think that they have found a style around ABO that's putting him on these hyperscaling AD carries, these hyperscaling marksmen in the mid lane, like the Zeri, like the Smolder, and just kind of allowing the rest of the team to play around that. Instinct and Winsome were really good as the Varus Rel. NA seems to very much still be favoring Varus. I'm sure that that's a comfort thing. You would have thought that he would have been a lot weaker going into this tournament, but he's still getting play, so definitely something to continue to monitor. But Fear looking great in game number one, about everything you could have asked for from them. And then for WAP on the other side, it's just not looking good. Like the macro is looking really bad, if I'm being entirely honest. Even some of the individual mechanical plays are just not looking great. This was not a good day number one for WAP, and at least through the first day, it does kind of look like they're the weakest team at the tournament, which definitely feels a bit disappointing. Certainly not what I would have loved to have seen. You know, you wanted to see everybody show up, but I guess somebody has to be, you know, a little bit off, at least on day one. They have plenty of time to bounce back. You have 2 more days of this round robin style, you know, tournament, but you only have 3 more games, and it's going to be pretty important for you to win some of those games. But Thorin is going to get yet another dead of the game on the top side. I mean, what do you do here? Like how am I supposed to give it to anybody else? The Olaf did less than 5k damage, and he got counterpick, and he got obliterated. He got solo killed in the 1v1 by Philip. It's just not really acceptable. Like, this is not the kind of performance that you can put on a stage like this and not get done of the game. Like, it is what it is. Hopefully he gets better over the course of this tournament, but it was not a very good day number one for him. I think QQ Moore was definitely the other player that I was considering on the Lilia for dead of the game. If only because, you know, kind of similarly to what we were talking about in game one for them against Dragonsteel, they were just late to every objective. They were just not in the right place at the right time. It didn't feel like they had a good understanding of side lane pressure and how to actually execute that, and there were so many engages coming in from the Lilia that just weren't very good. I think generally speaking, just over-eager and lost a lot of tempo in the early game. Shuhari wasn't particularly good. Diddy wasn't very good. Kindless didn't exactly do anything on the Jhin. I like the Jhin pick, but I mean, what are you supposed to do in this game? Overall, it felt like a bit of a gap. It felt like a bit of a hands gap, but even more so, it felt like a bit of a macro gap. And if WAP is going to be able to kind of turn around their form so far at this tournament, it's going to need to be through the macro game, because that's where they've really been lacking. Through the first couple of games, it very much has felt like they have been a bit gapped. They have played 2 of the harder teams at the tournament. I will give them that. I think that there is absolutely an opportunity for them to potentially pick up some wins against, you know, the other teams that you're kind of expecting them to be able to beat with their final few games of this round of the tournament, but they're going to have to make that change soon, because you're just starting to hit a point where it's becoming, like, problematic, like where it's going to be hard to win if you continue to make the mistakes in the mid game that they are currently making. But this was a very good win for Fear x Starforge. I think this is how they wanted to start off their tournament. This was pretty standard in terms of how they played. People were concerned because they did kind of get destroyed in the finals against Dragonsteel in the NACL, but I think this was such a good showing at the start of this tournament. You know, Dragonsteel has looked both good and bad, I would say, across this day so far. There is reason to believe that Fear is actually in a really well-placed position to be able to do really well at this tournament. But then moving into our final game here of day number 1, and if we thought the last game was the most dominating one, this one definitely takes the cake. It's Pain Academy taking on Fuego, and Pain absolutely obliterates them. This is a sub 22 minute, I'm barely a 21 minute game that Pain is able to just dominate. They picked Viego, Azir, Smolder with Maokai support. You have no options in the early game, and yet they won every single fight. The game was over at 9 minutes, like genuinely. They had one fight around these grubs at 9 minutes, and the game was just instantly over. There was nothing else for Fuego to be able to do from that point onwards. A very bad lane swap overall from Fuego, and just not a very good game from them. Ends up in a situation where they just look completely outclassed in this scenario. Pain looks unbelievable, though, after one day of competition. They clearly look like the best team at the tournament at the moment. I'm not trying to say that that will persist, but beating Dragonsteel was already huge, and then obliterating Fuego like this, who had won their first game, who was talked about as this potential, like, super team coming out of LATAM, like, this is an amazing performance from Pain. This is about everything you could have asked for from them on the first day. Player of the game, once again, is going to go to Hidan in the top lane. How do you give it to anybody else? This guy 1v4'd a fight in the bot lane and lived. He killed 2 and survived. Like, how is that possible? I get K'Sante is a ridiculously dumb champion and has so many tools in his tool belt that he can basically do whatever he wants, but you should never in a million years be able to get away with what Hidan was able to get away with in this game. It almost feels bad for the rest of Pain, because I think that a lot of other players on this team played really well in this game, and I'm excited to talk about that, but Hidan was so good that it ended up just completely throwing away a lot of the attention from the rest of the team. I do want to give a huge shout out to the Pain bot lane, because both of them are playing excellently. I know people were kind of talking them up as this potential like young rookie bot lane that could come in and actually be, you know, a big impact at this tournament. They, you know, were trying to get them a little bit more accustomed, or Marvin in particular was someone that they really wanted to make sure was comfortable in a lot of these big situations, but both of them have been excellent, I would say, over the beginning part of this tournament, and they continue to be great in this game. Marvin in particular has really impressed me across day number 1. I think both games that he has played they've looked really great. Like, he has really capitalized on the advantages of his own individual champion, even sometimes playing against the strengths of his champion and making it work in a lot of instances. Marvin just seems like a really talented player, and I'm really excited to see more of him. Cats in the mid lane was really good on the Azir. I really like patient Azirs. If you watch my LEC content, you know that I talk a lot about something called LEC Azir syndrome, where it feels like every single fight, if you play Azir, sometimes your brain just turns off and you feel like you have to be the #1 engage threat for your team. You have to Shreem and shuffle everybody into your team and start the team fight yourself. I love Azirs that are willing to play a lot more patient. I think oftentimes that is the right call on that champion, to be a little bit slower and safer in these fights, be able to do a lot of your damage front to back, and then when you find a good opportunity to kind of seal the fight, that's when you use your ultimate. I thought Cats actually did a really good job of that in the mid lane here. Tatu was good as well on the Viego. I mean, this was a romp from Pain. Like, this was not a close game. You're not going to be hearing me sit here and be like, oh, actually, like, you know, a couple of these players on Pain did a couple of things bad. No, this was just a dominant performance across the board. And unfortunately, that was at the expense of Fuego, who was looking so good after their first game of day number 1. That very much, unfortunately, did not carry over here into game 2. Dud of the game could go to basically anybody. I'm giving it to Virus FX. Again, you get this lane swap matchup. The Jinx should actually be in a relatively good position, and yet the K'Sante gets mega fed. You're not really in a good spot. The Jinx becomes entirely irrelevant, and the game is over very quickly. You know, I'd like to sit here and say, like, oh, 1 or 2 players ended up losing this, but no, Fuego was just kind of gapped across the board. They end up losing, like I said, this big fight around Grubs around 9 or 10 minutes into the game, and then from that point onwards, they're at such a gold disadvantage, and Pain is so aggressive, and they're so willing to try to take a lot of these fights that there's really no way for Fuego to get back into it. I think you could give this to Mataz as well in the jungle. You know, whoever you want to give dead of the game to, I think is fine. Zelt was not very good in this game. ADD was not very good in this game, was shut down very quickly on the Rumble. You know, there's not really a lot I can say. I hate to say this about the LATAM teams, but it certainly was kind of a question on whether or not they were going to be able to compete with a lot of the Brazilian and North American teams at this tournament, and at least so far, it's definitely been more up in the air. Now, Fuego did get that big win over Keedstars at the beginning of the day. That is a really good sign that potentially this team could start to figure something out. WAP didn't even really have that in terms of their performances, but I do think Fuego has some interesting things going for them. They just have to do better than whatever this was in the final game. There's really not a lot of analysis that I can give because it was just a complete stomp. This is one of those games where if it happens in a scrim, you like FF at 15, you go next. Like, there's nothing else to learn from this game after 15 minutes. So not good for Fuego, but really good for Pain. Pain looks unbelievable right now, and if they keep this pace up, I mean, there is an actual, like, very real chance that they end up winning this tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for day number 1 of the America's Challengers Tournament. My overview analysis video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Up on the screen, the updated standings. Of course, all you have to do is make top 4. You cannot be in the bottom 2. It's only day number 1. We've got so many games to go through. Some teams only played 1 game. You've got VKS, you know, down there with only 1 game played. We don't really know where they're at. Fearix Starforge only played 1 game here today. A lot can happen for the rest of these teams throughout the rest of this group group stage, this round robin stage, but you do have to make that top 4. And so definitely going to be an important day number 2 for everybody involved. I think the takeaways for day number 1 for me, North America looks good as expected. Maybe not as good. Dragonsteel doesn't feel quite as, unbeatable as maybe we thought. And that's because Pain Gaming right now, at least through the first day, probably looks like the best team at the tournament. We'll see if that continues to be the case. Hedon looks completely unstoppable, and Marvin has looked awesome down in the bot lane. If those things can keep up, Pain is going to be one of the teams to beat, if not the team to beat throughout the rest of this tournament. Fear looked really good in their first game. That was expected, but Fuego picking up a big win over VKS Academy. Not really what you expected. WAP, I think, definitely needs to turn things around, but LATAM's going to have their opportunity tomorrow when they play off against each other. There are a lot of interesting and fun storylines coming out of day number 1, but I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to do well moving forward? Who do you think maybe was a bit of an outlier here on day number 1? Do you think any of these teams can turn it around? Do you think maybe a top tier team might start to struggle more as things go along? Or do you think maybe one of the teams in the bottom 2 right now, VKS or WAP, could actually do better as the rest of this round robin stage goes on? I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, it really would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. It does help out the channel a ton and helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We, of course, post about everything in terms of WAP Esports. We'll be covering the rest of this America's Challengers tournament every single day, but we've got a ton of Worlds coverage coming right around the corner. Things like Meta Report, talking about what you can expect, not only, I guess, at this tournament, but at Worlds as well. We've got top 20 players at Worlds. We've got our power rankings and everything for Worlds, both players and teams. A lot of content coming up around the corner. If you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in WAP Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all